If you think you've heard everything about World War II, brace yourself. This soldier survived the horrors of the battlefield, but what he found when he returned home was worse than any bomb. A simple ticket, a piece of paper that destroyed more lives than many weapons of war. You won't believe what was written on it. This is not a war film. This is the true story of a man who discovered that the worst battles are not fought with weapons but with words. Words that destroy the soul. What did that note say? What could be so devastating that it made a soldier who faced death every day for years wish he had never survived? Don't look away. Don't pause this video, because what you will discover in the next few minutes will completely change your view of the true price of war. William, our soldier, was just 23 years old when he traded his wife's arms for a rifle, a boy with dreams, a ring on his finger, and her promise ringing in his ears. I will wait for you, no matter how long it takes. Over 3 years he wrote 47 letters, letters stained with blood, mud, tears, letters that never received a response. Can you feel the anguish, doubt growing in your mind as bombs fell around you? Every day was a postponed death sentence, every night a torment of nightmares. But William had something that many had already lost. Hope, the hope of returning, the hope of embracing again the woman who swore eternal love. And finally that day arrived. The train stopped at the station. The city felt different, strangely empty. Streets that were once familiar now seemed like no man's land. That's when he saw it. On the door of the house he once called home, hanging from the doorknob like a flag of surrender, was the note. His hands shook, his heart failed. Something inside him already knew. A part of him wanted to run away, go back to the war where at least the enemy had a face. In the next few minutes, you will delve into this soldier's full story. A journey that begins in the trenches of Europe, crosses the ocean back home, and culminates in this moment, when he finally reads the note that would change his destiny forever. What was written in those few lines? Why did so many soldiers like William return home, only to discover that some battles are unwinnable? And most importantly, what happened after he read those devastating words? Stay until the end, because this story isn't just about a ticket. It's about betrayal, survival, and the true meaning of war that never appears in history books. A story that could have been that of your grandfather, your father, or that could one day be yours. Each of us carries our own invisible battles. Like William, we all know the anxiety of waiting and the fear of what we might find when we finally return home. This story reveals the side of war that history books never told, the scars that no one can see. Leave your like now and subscribe to the channel to learn more real stories of soldiers who changed the course of history. The world celebrated the end of the greatest conflict in human history. On the streets of New York, London, and Paris, crowds applauded their heroes. Young people who left as boys and returned as men, marked forever. Among them was William Parker, 23 years old, decorated for bravery in combat, one of millions who were now trying to relearn how to live in a world that no longer recognized them. What no one tells you about war is the silence that comes after, that deafening silence when the soldier finally sits alone on the bed in his old room and realizes that he will never be the same person again, when the noise of the bombs is replaced by the demons inside your own mind. For William, the worst thing wasn't the shots that almost killed him in Normandy. It wasn't the friends he saw in agony as he held his hands. There were no sleepless nights in flooded trenches. The real hell began when he returned home and found a note on the door. A ticket, just a piece of paper folded in half. The kind of thing that normally wouldn't change anyone's fate. But in this case, it turned a war hero into a shadow, in a ghost that wandered the streets with a lost gaze, in a man who survived hell only to discover he had nothing left to live for. Can you imagine? Facing death daily for years, fight for a future, for a home, for someone you love, and then discover that that someone, that reason you kept breathing when everything inside you wanted to give up, just wasn't there anymore. The story I'm going to tell today is not in school books. It was not made into successful Hollywood films. It's one of those stories that governments prefer to forget because it shows the side of the war that no one wants to see, the after. What happens when the cameras turn off and the veterans are left alone with their visible and invisible scars? The note William found that day changed not just his life, but that of an entire generation of men who discovered that returning from war was just the beginning of the battle. A battle against memories, against nightmares, against a world that moved on while they were frozen in the time of the trenches. Every word on that paper was like a bullet. Every sentence, a bomb exploding right in front of him. And unlike the battles he faced in Europe, this time William had no shield, no weapon, no way to defend himself. Remember this name, William Parker, a hero who survived the war only to be defeated by 5 hastily written lines on a note. A man who faced the enemy face to face, but who was not prepared to face what he would find at home. Have you ever felt like you've survived the worst, only to discover that the real challenge was yet to come? These stories of resilience are part of the fabric that forms our humanity. Share in the comments a time when you needed to find inner strength to move forward when everything seemed lost. Your story can inspire others who are facing their own invisible battles. William was not born a soldier. He was born the son of a carpenter and a teacher in a small country town. He grew up fishing in the river on Sundays and dreaming of one day taking over his father's carpentry business. He had the same dreams that many of us have: a stable job, a family, a place to call yours. When he met Anna at the 1941 spring dance, William told his best friend that he had found the woman with whom he would spend the rest of his life. He was right, just not in the way he imagined. The engagement was brief. The news of the war arrived like distant thunder, getting closer and closer. In his diary, which was found decades later, William wrote on the eve of leaving for training, "Anna is my safe haven. When everything goes dark, I think of her face and find light again. She promised to wait, and that's all I need to know." In the 47 letters he wrote during the war, William mentions Anna in all of them, like a mantra, like a prayer, like the only thing that kept him sane when everything around him was chaos and destruction. Today we lost Thompson, shrapnel in his chest. I couldn't do anything but hold his hand as he left. In moments like this, I close my eyes and see you, Anna, and I remember why I'm fighting. Have you ever held on to a memory, a person, a promise to get you through your darkest moments? William and you are not so different in this. We all need an anchor when the storm threatens to sweep us away. For him, it was Anna. For you, maybe it's someone equally special. The ring on William's finger was more than a symbol. It was a constant reminder of the future that awaited him. When the cold of the trenches was unbearable, he would rub the golden metal and feel the warmth of the promises made under the summer stars in his city. In his last letter, sent 3 weeks before the end of the war, William wrote, "They say we will be back soon, that this will all finally be over. The only thing that kept me human in this hell was knowing that you wait for me, that when I open our gate, you will be there, as you promised, with your blue dress and that smile that brightens even the darkest days." The cruelest part is that he survived. He survived when so many others couldn't. He crossed the ocean back with Anna's photo in his uniform pocket, the same photo he looked at thousands of times in the trenches, the photo that was now crumpled, faded, but that to William was worth more than any medal. On the train ride back to his hometown, William met another veteran, an older man looking lost who told him something he didn't understand at the time. "Boy, for some of us the worst part of war starts when we come home." William smiled politely and looked out the window again, counting the hours, the minutes, the seconds, until he finally hugged Anna again. "To smell your perfume," to say everything that didn't fit in the 47 letters. The other passengers on the train noticed how restless he was, how he smiled alone, looking at the horizon. A boy who, despite everything he saw and experienced, still believed that life could be fair and that promises were meant to be kept. What William didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that those would be his last hours of hope. That the world he knew before the war had disappeared, not just in the philosophical sense that all veterans experience, but in a much more personal and devastating way. Maybe you've already felt this, that feeling of returning to a place that should be familiar, but has somehow completely changed, as if you were a stranger in your own life. William was about to feel this with an intensity few of us will ever experience. Share in the comments. What was the most important promise someone ever made to you? Was it fulfilled or broken? Your story can help others feel less alone in their own battles. The train slowed with a long metallic sigh. William straightened his uniform for the 100th time and picked up his backpack. Through the window he saw the station. Platform he had known since he was a child. The same wooden boards, the same old clock. But something was different. The silence. There was no music band. There were no crowds waving flags. There was no Anna in her blue dress. Just a few station employees and an elderly lady waiting for someone who wasn't him. Maybe she's waiting at home, thought William, trying to ignore that first tightness in his chest. Perhaps you didn't receive my telegram informing you of your arrival. The streets were strangely empty for a Thursday afternoon. William walked with increasingly faster steps, almost running. Every familiar corner now looked different, as if the entire city had been subtly altered while he was gone. Mr. Hoffman's bakery was closed, with boards on the windows. The park where he proposed to Anna now had a monument to those fallen in war, names carved in stone. Some he recognized, boys he grew up with and would never go back to. As he approached his street, William felt a growing weight within him, a feeling that something fundamental had changed and that nothing would be the same as before. The same feeling he had minutes before his first battle, when silence preceded the storm of fire and steel. The houses seemed smaller now, more worn out. Or was it your perception that had changed? 3 years in places where destruction was as common as sunrise changes the way you see the world. William stopped at the corner of his street. 6 houses away was home, the place that appeared in your dreams on the coldest and loneliest nights. I could see the old oak tree in the yard, the swing your father built, and something else, something different. Children playing in the yard, children he didn't know. William felt his legs weaken. He leaned against a nearby fence and took a deep breath. It must be a mistake, he thought. Maybe it's in the wrong house, maybe it's Anna's nephew's. But he knew, somewhere deep inside him, he already knew. Even so, he continued walking, one step after another, as he had done so many times under enemy fire. A soldier learns to move forward even when every instinct screams to retreat. The neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, was watering the plants. When he saw William, he dropped the watering can. His face turned pale as if he was seeing a ghost. William? William Parker? My God, you're alive. Those words fell on him like an avalanche. You're alive, as if it shouldn't be, as if all that time. Anna, he managed, his voice almost unrecognizable even to himself. Where's Anna? Mrs. Peterson looked away. William, honey, you should talk to Pastor Johnson first. He might... But William no longer listened. He had started walking towards his house again. Your house with unknown children playing in the yard. Your home where something was deeply wrong. That's when he saw it. At the front door, a small envelope attached to the doorknob, with her name written in that handwriting she knew as well as her own. Anna's handwriting. The world around him seemed to slow down until it came to a complete stop. The sound of children playing, the birdsong, everything disappeared. There was just William and that envelope, the last line between the man who went to war and what he would become later. Neighbors watching the scene from the safety of their windows would later describe how William stood there, as still as a statue, for nearly 10 minutes before finally reaching for the envelope, as if every inch was a battle, as if he already knew that when he opened that paper, the war he thought he had left behind would enter a new phase, a phase for which no training could have prepared him. The envelope was simple, plain paper, slightly yellowed with age. He looked like he had been placed there weeks, maybe months ago, waiting for a man no one believed would return. William's name was written in Anna's slanted handwriting, that handwriting he could recognize among thousands. William removed it from the doorknob carefully, as if it were a fragile artifact that could fall apart between his fingers. The weight was insignificant, just a few grams of paper, but it carried the weight of an entire future. His hands, which had remained steady even in the worst moments of the war, were now shaking uncontrollably. The same hands that held rifles, that carried wounded friends, that dug trenches in the frozen earth of Europe, could now barely open a simple envelope. William? The voice came from behind. Him. Pastor Johnson, warned by Mrs. Peterson, was walking quickly down the street. His face was a mask of concern and compassion. Son, wait. You shouldn't find out like this. Let's talk first. But William didn't listen. Or maybe you heard it, but chose to ignore it. In a quick, almost violent movement, he tore the envelope. Inside, a single folded piece of paper, a short letter, just a few lines. Pastor Johnson stopped a few meters away, respecting the moment. I knew what was written on that paper. The whole city knew. They had watched the tragedy slowly unfold, powerless to change its course. William unfolded the paper with numb fingers. A part of him still clung to hope. Maybe it was just a message. Perhaps Anna was visiting relatives. Maybe there was a simple explanation for all that, for the kids in the yard, for Mrs. Peterson's gaze, to the silence that greeted him. His eyes ran over the words once, then again, and once again, as if searching for a different meaning. as if the same words read enough times could magically transform into others. Pastor Johnson saw the exact moment that realization hit William. He saw his shoulders slump. He saw the soldier's rigidity, maintained even after years of war, simply disappear, like air escaping from a balloon. It was like watching a man age 20 years in 20 seconds. She thought I was dead," William finally spoke, his voice distant, as if it were coming from somewhere else, from someone else. "We all do." "Son," the pastor replied softly, taking a step forward, "your platoon was reported lost. Telegrams arrived. There was even a symbolic funeral." "A funeral," William repeated the words as if they were in a foreign language he was trying to decipher. "They had a funeral for me." The letter shook in his hand. 5 lines. Just 5 lines that redefined his entire existence, that turned a war hero returning home into a ghost, an intruder in his own life. Pastor Johnson reached out for William's shoulder, but stopped before touching him. What could you say? What words could possibly ease that moment? William folded the paper slowly and placed it in his uniform pocket, next to Anna's photo. The photo that now seemed to belong to another life, another man, another reality. The children in the yard had stopped playing. They watched with the innocent curiosity of childhood, the strange man in uniform standing in front of their house. Your home now, no longer William's house. "How long?" William asked, still not looking at the pastor. "She waited almost 2 years, William. Longer than many. The grief almost destroyed her. And then life went on, as it always does." William nodded mechanically. In his mind, they flashed by all the times he almost died during the war. The bullet that passed inches from his head, the grenade that didn't explode, the artillery shot that killed everyone around him but spared him. Every time death surrounded him, and for some reason he decided to let it live for that. To come back and discover that her life had gone on without him. Something inside William broke at that moment. It was not a dramatic collapse. There was no screaming or tears. It was something deeper, more definitive, like a tree that, after weathering raging storms, finally gives way with a quiet sigh during a light breeze. Do we all have a moment like this? A precise instant in which something fundamental changes within us? Share in the comments. What was the discovery that completely changed your perspective on life? What did you find that transformed everything you thought you knew? The words in the note burned in his mind as if they had been engraved with iron. I didn't need to take it out of my pocket to read it again. Those 5 lines were already permanently marked in his memory. "William, I waited as long as I could. I thought you died. I married again. Don't come back. Anna." The brutality of the last line. "Don't come back," as if he were a threat, a danger, an unwanted ghost returning to haunt the living. William stood on the sidewalk looking at the house that was once his. Pastor Johnson remained by his side, not knowing what to say, respecting the silence that seemed to be the only possible response to such deep pain. Inside the house, a figure appeared at the window. A man, older than William, with hair already grey at the temples. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and William saw in them not hostility, but something worse, pity. It was Robert Chambers. William knew him from school, a good man, a man who didn't go to war because of a leg injured as a child, a man who stayed behind and comforted the wives, the girlfriends, the mothers who received the telegrams with the news that everyone feared, and now Anna's husband. "Do they have children?" William asked, his voice strangely calm. The pastor hesitated but replied, "A boy, born 6 months ago, a son, a new beginning, a family that didn't include William Parker, the soldier who came back from the dead only to discover there was no place for him in the world of the living." William felt a bitter laugh rising in his throat. How ironic, surviving the worst humanity had to offer, only to discover that your reward was this emptiness, this feeling of being completely out of place, like a puzzle piece forced into place where it no longer belongs. What hurt most were not the words in the note. It was the memory of all the nights in the trenches, looking up at the stars and imagining this moment, the moment of return, how I had planned every detail, how I would hug Anna, what would you say to her, how I could finally tell all the things that didn't fit in the letters that, he now realized, probably never arrived, or they arrived too late, or they were received when Anna was already in mourning, had already accepted her death, had already begun to rebuild her life. The telegrams, They said my entire platoon was dead. But there were 30 of us. How could they be sure? The pastor shook his head. It was chaos, William. You know what war is like. Unrecognizable bodies, confusing lists of names, interrupted communication, and then, well, then life went on. Life went on. This simple sentence contained the full horror of the situation. Life went on without William Parker. The world didn't stop when he died. He didn't wait for his return. He moved on, indifferent, implacable. What should I do now? William asked, not really expecting an answer. It was more of a silent cry to the universe, a question that echoed in the void. You can stay in the rectory for now, offered the pastor, until I decide. Some old-timers are heading west, starting over. Maybe, but William no longer listened. His eyes were fixed on the house, in your house, in the life that should have been yours. Robert had disappeared from the window. The children had returned to playing, their temporary curiosity for the stranger already forgotten. Life continued its course like a river that simply bypasses a stone in its path. Neighbors watched discreetly from their windows. The news would quickly spread throughout the small town. William Parker returned from the war. William Parker, who everyone thought was dead. William Parker, whose name was almost added to the monument in the park. William Parker, who was now nobody. Without thinking, he reached into his pocket and touched the cards. All 47 letters he had written to Anna during the war. Letters he never sent because there was rarely any way to send correspondence from the front. Letters that he kept, that he reread on the darkest nights, that he promised to deliver in person when he returned. Letters that were now just paper. Words written by a man who in every way that mattered had died in the war, even if his body continued to breathe. William took a step back, then another. Walking away from the house, the note, the life that was no longer his. The pastor was saying something, but his voice seemed to come from far away, muffled by the storm that was now raging inside William's head. The days that followed passed like a hazy dream for William. He accepted the pastor's offer and settled in the small room at the back of the rectory, a simple space with a narrow bed, a wooden table and a window that looked out onto the church cemetery. William thought the view was appropriate, a man who came back from the dead contemplating the place where the true dead rested. The first few nights he couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, rereading the 47 letters he wrote to Anna, words of love, of hope, of future plans that now sounded like fate's cruel jokes. In one of the letters, written after a particularly bloody battle, he had said, "I survived for you today, Anna. When all seemed lost, it was your face that gave me the strength to carry on." How ironic, surviving for someone who had already buried him, to continue fighting for a future that no longer existed. During the day, William wandered around the city like a ghost. People watched him with a mix of fascination and discomfort. The dead man who returned, the soldier who lost more than just years in war. The elders greeted him with distant respect. Young people pointed and whispered. Mothers pulled their children away as he passed, as if his tragedy were contagious. William watched all this with a strange detachment, as if you were watching someone else's life, as if the real William Parker had, in his suit, died in that distant war, and the one who returned was just a shadow, an echo, an incomplete version. "It's the shock," said Dr. Matthews, who came to visit him regularly at the pastor's request. "It's normal after what you've been through. It'll get better with time." But William knew it wasn't just the shock of war. It wasn't the sound of the bombs that still echoed in his ears in the quietest moments. It wasn't the faces of his dead companions that he saw. When he closed his eyes, it was something deeper, a fundamental question that consumed him. Why did he survive? Why, among so many men better than him, was William Parker the one who returned home? For that? To discover that your life had been an illusion? That while he clung to the memory of Anna in the trenches, she had already left him behind? There were days when William wished he had died in the war. At least he would have left believing that Anna was waiting for him. He would have died, with her photo in his pocket and her name on his lips. I would have left with the illusion intact. On a particularly gloomy afternoon, William took courage and went to the post office. I needed to know. "My letters?" he asked old Mr. Jenkins, who had run the post office for more than 30 years. "The letters I sent during the war, did they arrive?" Mr. Jenkins looked at him with compassion. "Some, yes, in the first few weeks. Then, well, communications with the front were difficult. No. And when the news came that your platoon had been, well, a lot of things got lost in the shuffle. William nodded. That's what I suspected. His words never arrived. Your promises, your dreams, your plans, all lost somewhere between the trenches of Europe and this small American town, like so many other things. As he walked back to the rectory, William saw his reflection in a store window. He didn't recognize the man looking back at him. The opaque eyes, premature lines around the mouth, the hunched posture, as if carrying an invisible weight. At 23, William Parker looked like he had lived several lives, all of them marked by loss. It was at that moment that the question that tormented him finally found its answer. Why did he survive? There was no reason. There was no grand purpose. There was no divine plan. It was just the cruel chance of war. Some men live, others die, and some, like William, get stuck in an in-between state, neither truly alive nor truly dead. In his pocket, he still carried Anna's note, those 5 lines that had destroyed everything. Don't come back, as if it were a choice, as if there was nowhere to go back to. What Anna didn't understand, what no one who hadn't been to the war could understand, is that William never came back, not really. His body was there walking through the familiar streets of his childhood, but he himself, his essence, had remained on some distant battlefield, buried with his companions, with his dreams, with the person he was before the war transformed everything. In the 3rd week after his return, William awoke to the sound of a raging storm. The thunder made the windows of the rectory shake. For a disorienting moment, he was back in the trenches. The noise of thunder turned into artillery explosions. The rain that lashed the roof turned into the sound of machine guns firing non-stop. William found himself huddled in the corner of the room, shaking uncontrollably, eyes wide with terror, searching for an enemy that wasn't there. His body was covered in cold sweat. His heart was beating so hard it felt like it would explode in his chest. When reality finally returned, when the thunder became just thunder again, and not falling bombs, William felt a deep shame. Was this what it had become? A man scared by a simple storm. But it wasn't just the storm. It was everything. The entire world seemed hostile now. People talking too loud, the doors slamming, cars passing too fast on the street. Everything was a potential trigger. Everything could transport him back to the horror. William began to avoid going out during the day. He preferred night walks when the streets were empty and there were no curious or worse, pious eyes. It was during one of these walks that he ended up in front of the house that was once his. The lights were on downstairs. Through the window, William could see Anna sitting in an armchair, cradling a baby. Your baby. With another man. She smiled that soft smile that William knew so well. The smile that had once been his alone. William stood on the sidewalk, protected by the shade of a tree, watching the domestic scene that must have been his life. The pain he felt was not sharp like before. It was something deeper, more permanent. A pain that had become part of him, indistinguishable from his own identity. It was at that moment that William understood something crucial. The war never ends for the soldier. Even when the guns fall silent, even when treaties are signed and military parades take place, the war continues. Inside it, relentless, constant, an internal battle that no armistice could end. The enemy now were not soldiers in different uniforms. It was the sound of a door slamming that made him jump. It was the inability to sleep more than 2 hours without being woken by vivid nightmares. It was the constant feeling of being alert, vigilant, waiting for a danger that never arrives but always seems imminent. And above all, it was loneliness. A loneliness so deep, so absolute, that it made the solitude of the trenches seem like a lively social gathering in comparison. At least in war, he was surrounded by men who understood, who lived the same reality, who shared the same fear, the same hope, the same longing for home. Now he was completely alone with his demons. William started drinking. Not much at first, just a glass to help you sleep. Then 2. Then the whole bottle. Alcohol didn't silence the voices in his head. It didn't erase the images that haunted him, but it made everything more distant, more hazy, more bearable. The pastor tried to intervene. He got William a job at the local sawmill, a simple, repetitive job that didn't require much thought. The idea was to give structure to your days, something to occupy your hands and mind. For a while it worked. William arrived early, did his work in silence, and left. The other workers left him alone, respecting his history and his desire for isolation. But there were always the sidelong glances, the whispers when they thought he couldn't hear. It's the one who came back from the war, the one about the wife who remarried. Poor thing, it's not the same anymore. And he wasn't. The William who went to war was gone forever. The one who came back was someone else, a stranger inhabiting a familiar body, a man divided between two worlds, not completely belonging to either of them. One night, after a particularly difficult day at the sawmill, William pulled out the 47 letters he had never managed to send to Anna. He reread each one of them one last time. Then, one by one, he threw them into the fire in the small fireplace that heated his room in the rectory. As he watched them burn, turning into ash and smoke, William felt something break inside him, but he also felt, for the first time since returning, a strange kind of peace, as if he was finally accepting the truth he had been trying to deny ever since he read Anna's note. The war was over, but for William the hardest battle was just beginning. The battle to find some purpose, some meaning in a world that had moved on without him. The battle to rebuild himself, not as the man he was, but as the man he could be from now on. Have you ever felt like your life is divided into before and after a significant event? Share your experience in the comments and show William that he is not as alone as he thinks. No one knows for sure what happened to William Parker after that winter of 1945. City records show he worked at the sawmill for nearly 2 years. He lived quietly, doing his work, avoiding contact beyond what was necessary. Some people say he would occasionally visit the local bar, sit alone in the darkest corner, and drink in silence, lost in thoughts that no one dared interrupt. What we know for sure is that in the spring of 1947, William Parker disappeared. He just didn't show up for work on a Monday. Pastor Johnson went to the small room at the back of the parsonage and found everything in order. The bed made, the few clothes folded carefully, no ticket, no explanation, just an empty chair and silence. Some say William went west, like so many other veterans, seeking a new beginning in lands where no one knew his history. Others believe he re-enlisted, unable to readjust to civilian life, seeking the brutal familiarity of war rather than the discomfort of peace. There are even those who whisper that he ended his own life, finally overcome by the war that continued inside him long after the guns fell silent. The truth is that William Parker has become a ghost, not the kind that haunts old houses, but the kind that haunts the conscience of a nation, a reminder of the invisible costs of war, of the scars that cannot be seen, but that change a man forever. Anna never spoke publicly about William after he disappeared. He continued his life with Robert and their son. He had 2 more children. From what everyone could see, he was happy. But Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor who first saw William return that fateful day, said she sometimes caught Anna looking down the street with a distant expression, as if she were waiting for someone who would never arrive. The note Anna left for William disappeared along with it, those 5 lines that changed the course of a life, who turned a war hero into a broken man, who showed, with brutal clarity, that surviving is not always winning. William Parker's story is not unique. Thousands of soldiers returned from World War II to find that life had gone on without them, that the promises made before departure did not always withstand the harsh reality of separation, uncertainty, time, that even when the body returned in one piece, something essential was left behind on the battlefields. They called it combat fatigue at the time. Today, we know it as post-traumatic stress disorder, a technical name for a condition that has nothing technical or clinical about it when you are living within it, when every loud noise is a threat, when sleeping means reliving the horror night after night, when peace becomes scarier than war. For men like William, the real battlefield was not in Europe or the Pacific, it was inside them, a war that continued long after the treaties were signed, a silent war fought in the shadows of the mind, without an audience, without medals, without recognition, and the cruelest, a war fought in complete solitude. There is a photo in the local museum, a group of smiling young people in impeccable uniforms, about to set off to defend their country. William Parker is there, in the second row, with that confident smile of someone who believes he will return to everything he left behind, that the world will pause during your absence, that life will wait for him. Next to this photo, there is a plaque with the names of those who never returned, the official heroes, those who had funerals with folded flags and public tears. William Parker's name is not on that list. Officially, he survived. He returned home, lived, But for those who know the true story, who saw the man who returned on that train, who witnessed his slow disappearance, not just from the city but from himself, know the truth. William Parker was yet another victim of the war. His body returned, but something essential was left behind, buried along with his fallen comrades. The war spared him, but not love, and perhaps this is the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes, what hurts most is not what war takes from you on the battlefield. It's what you don't find when you finally return home. History and memory intertwine in ways we often ignore. What happened to William Parker is not just an isolated narrative from the past. It is a silent reflection of thousands of soldiers who returned physically from wars, but left their souls on the battlefields. Stories like this are not just about trauma and loss. They are about our ability to recognize the true human cost of the conflicts we celebrate in history books. Each veteran carries an invisible note, a silent message that few have the courage to read. Your like and subscription to this channel are not just clicks. They are acts of honor to the memory of those who continue to fight invisible battles even decades after the last shot. William's story is the story of his grandfather, his uncle, maybe even his father. Men who came back different, carrying burdens they never chose. Many of them left without telling everything they had experienced, without revealing the truths they kept in their chests like bullets that could never be removed. Share in the comments if you know someone whose war story has never been fully told. This could be your way of honoring them. There are even more impactful revelations awaiting you. Secrets of war that have remained buried for decades. Truths that will forever change your view of the heroes we think we know. Click on the next video now and discover the other side of the story. The one that no one has had the courage to tell until today.